In 1957, Fiat launched a car so small that critics questioned whether it was a real automobile at all. It cost about 11 months of an average Italian worker's wages. It produced 13 horsepower. Its top speed was roughly 53 miles per hour. And when it first appeared on the streets of Turin, many Italians considered it an embarrassment. Today, that same car is one of the most recognizable objects in the history of design. Museums display it. Fashion houses use it in advertising. Cities that had nothing to do with its origin sell it as a symbol of a lifestyle. And in 2007, 50 years after that modest debut, Fiat relaunched it, and people waited in lines to buy a car built around nostalgia for a machine their grandparents had purchased because they had almost no other choice. That transformation, from desperate necessity to cultural desire, is one of the most unusual stories in automotive history. But to understand it, you have to go back to a country that had nearly destroyed itself, and to an engineer who was asked to solve a problem that most of the industry considered impossible. Before we go further, if you're watching this on your television and enjoying the story, sharing this video is one of the most important things you can do for this channel. It costs nothing, but it reaches people who would never find this on their own. If you haven't subscribed yet, it genuinely helps us keep making these. Now back to Italy. The Italy of 1945 barely resembled the country that exists today. The war had killed an estimated 450,000 Italians. The cities of the industrial north, Turin, Milan, Genoa, had been heavily bombed. Turin, where Fiat had its factories, suffered more than 100 Allied air raids during the war. Nearly 40% of its housing stock was damaged or destroyed. The Fiat Mirafiori plant, the largest automobile factory in the country, had been a deliberate target. When the fighting stopped, the railways were broken, the roads were damaged, the merchant fleet had been largely sunk, and agricultural production had collapsed to the point where genuine hunger was a daily reality for millions of people. The lira was nearly worthless. Inflation made planning for the next month a matter of guesswork. In the rural south of Italy, in Calabria, in Sicily, in the interior of Sardinia, the situation was even more severe. Donkeys still outnumbered automobiles. Women still dressed in floor-length black skirts, spending most of their working lives in mourning clothes. The phrase personal mobility would have meant almost nothing to the majority of the Italian population. Getting from one town to the next was a matter of waiting for a bus that might not come, or walking. This was the country Fiat was trying to sell cars to. The company had survived the war in a damaged state, but it had survived. And by the late 1940s, as Italy began the slow, painful work of reconstruction, Fiat's leadership understood something clearly. The country needed to move. Not symbolically, physically. Workers in the industrial north needed to get to factories. People arriving from the south in search of employment needed transportation within cities, whose public systems were overwhelmed. The economy needed to grow, and growth required people to move goods, services, and to themselves. The obvious tool for that movement was a car. The problem was that almost nobody could afford one. In the early 1950s, owning a car in Italy was still largely a privilege of the professional class. The Fiat 1100, a reasonable family automobile, was beyond the financial reach of a factory worker saving carefully. The alternative for millions of Italians was the Vespa, the small motor scooter that Piaggio had developed in 1946 from a company that had been making aircraft before the war ended and needed to pivot quickly to something civilians would buy. The Vespa was brilliant for its purpose. It was cheap, it was simple, it was manageable on narrow streets. By the mid-1950s, it had become one of the defining objects of Italian daily life. But a scooter had limits. It offered no protection from weather. It could not easily carry a passenger and cargo at once. And in a country where families were growing and factory wages were beginning slowly to rise, many Italians were starting to want something more. Fiat had already answered part of this demand. In 1955, the company launched the Fiat 600, a small rear-engined car that was genuinely affordable by the standards of the time and genuinely practical for Italian city conditions. The 600 was an important vehicle. It brought car ownership to a new class of Italian buyers who had never been able to consider it before. But even the 600 was too expensive for the lowest tier of the working population. The factory migrants arriving from the south, the craftsmen working in small workshops, the families living on a single modest income in a rented apartment in Turin or Milan. They needed something cheaper, smaller, more basic. Fiat's management gave that problem to Dante Giacosa. Giacosa was not a dramatic figure. He was not the kind of engineer who made speeches or sought public attention. He had been born in Rome in 1905, studied engineering at the Polytechnic University of Turin, and joined Fiat in 1928 at the age of 23. He had spent his entire professional life there. By the 1950s, he was the company's chief engineer, the person responsible for translating Fiat's commercial ambitions into actual machines that could be manufactured at scale. He had done this before. In the 1930s, Giacosa had been the primary engineer behind the original Fiat 500, a car known as the Topolino, Italian for Little Mouse, which had been one of the smallest production cars in the world when it appeared in 1936. That car had given a previous generation of Italians their first experience of personal automobile ownership. It was a genuine achievement. But the Topolino was also a pre-war design, and the post-war world had different demands, different production realities, and a different economic landscape. Now, Giacosa was asked to go further. The brief, as later described, was uncompromising. Build the smallest practical car possible, with the lowest possible running costs, at a price that a factory worker could realistically consider. Not the sort of factory worker who had been saving for 5 years, the kind who was thinking about it for the first time. This was not a simple engineering challenge. It was a series of constraints that pushed against each other in every direction. Making a car smaller reduced material costs, but also reduced the value customers could perceive. Making it cheaper to run required mechanical simplicity, but simplicity sometimes meant reliability problems. Keeping the price low meant cutting everything that was not absolutely essential. And then cutting further. Giacosa's solution involved a set of decisions that, taken individually, seemed almost obvious, but combined to produce something genuinely new. He placed the engine at the rear of the car. This was not unprecedented. Fiat's own 600 used the same layout, and the Volkswagen Beetle had established the concept in European mass production. But for the tiny 500, a rear-mounted engine had a specific advantage. It eliminated the need for a long hood at the front of the car. That freed space for a cabin that could, with careful packaging, fit 2 adults in the front and 2 more in the back, even in a vehicle that measured less than 10 feet from end to end. The engine itself was remarkable in its modesty. A 2-cylinder, air-cooled unit displacing 479 cubic centimeters, producing 13 horsepower. Air-cooled meant no radiator, no coolant system, fewer parts to fail, less weight, and lower cost. The trade-off was that air-cooled engines could run hot, and they could be noisier than water-cooled alternatives. In the Fiat 500, particularly when pushed near its limits on a hill, passengers were acutely aware that something mechanical was working very hard just behind their heads. The suspension was fully independent at all 4 wheels, a detail that gave the car better road holding than its dimensions suggested, and that mattered on Italian roads that ranged from reasonable urban paving to genuinely rough provincial surfaces. The doors opened backwards, hinged at the rear rather than the front. This was a practical decision in tight spaces. A rear-hinged door allowed a driver or passenger to step out into a narrow gap without fighting the door against the direction of exit. In Italy, where parking spaces in old city centers were often barely wider than the car itself, this was not a trivial consideration. The roof was partly canvas, a fold-back fabric panel that could be opened to the sky in good weather. This was not a luxury feature. It was a cost reduction that happened to be pleasant. Full metal roofs required more material and more complex pressing dies. A fabric roof saved money while giving the car a quality that people would later describe in romantic terms. even though it was originally an economy measure. Put all of these decisions together, and you had a vehicle that was genuinely tiny, genuinely affordable, and genuinely capable of carrying 4 people through the streets of an Italian city without requiring them to be particularly wealthy or particularly patient. Giacosa had answered the brief. The car was ready. On July 4th, 1957, Fiat unveiled the Nuova 500, the new 500, by sending dozens of examples through the streets of Turin. The launch price was 490,000 lire, roughly 11 months of an average worker's wages. And Italy looked at it and was not sure what to think. The initial reaction to the Fiat 500 was not triumph. It was skepticism. Critics in the Italian press questioned whether Fiat had produced something useful or simply something cheap. The car's 13 horsepower struggled on inclines. The lack of a synchronized gearbox made changing gears in traffic a skill that required practice. The rear hinged doors felt unfamiliar and made some potential buyers nervous. The interior was basic to the point of austerity. No padded seats in the ordinary sense. Minimal instrumentation. Windows that opened by rotating a small handle rather than winding down in the conventional way. Most pointedly, the price, while low by any existing standard for a 4-seat car, was still not low enough to feel like a spontaneous purchase for the working-class buyers Fiat was targeting. 11 months of wages was real money. And compared to the Fiat 600, which offered more power and slightly more space, the 500's price premium required explanation. Sales in the first months were slow. Fiat had expected to sell somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 cars in the first year. The initial orders fell well short of enthusiasm. The company responded quickly. By December 1957, just 5 months after launch, Fiat introduced 2 revised versions of the car. The Economica kept the basic shape, but added a slightly more powerful engine producing 15 horsepower and dropped the price below the original launch figure. The Normale offered the same improved engine with rear seating that could actually accommodate adults, proper wind-up windows replacing the rotating handles, and turn signal controls moved to the steering column where drivers expected them. These were not cosmetic changes. They were corrections, admissions that the original version had been priced slightly wrong, packaged slightly short, and positioned at a market that Fiat hadn't quite understood yet. With the revisions, the 500 began to find its customers. They were not always the customers Fiat had originally imagined. Yes, factory workers bought the car, young men arriving in Turin from the south, earning their first factory wages in the industrial northern cities, saved and purchased a 500 as their first automobile. For millions of Italians, the Fiat 500 was literally the first car their family had ever owned. That reality is central to understanding what the car eventually became. But something else was also happening. Alongside the workers and the modest earners, another kind of buyer was discovering the car and interpreting it completely differently. In the late 1950s and through the early 1960s, Italy was undergoing one of the most extraordinary economic transformations in the history of any peacetime nation. Historians would later call it il miracolo economico, the economic miracle. Between 1958 and 1963, Italy's gross domestic product grew at an average rate that transformed the country within a single decade from a largely agricultural economy still living with wartime damage into one of the leading industrial powers in Europe. The factories of Turin were producing hundreds of thousands of cars each year. Refrigerators, washing machines, and televisions were appearing in households that had owned none of those things a decade earlier. Turin's population grew from around 719,000 people in 1951 to more than 1.1 million by 1971. A growth driven by the constant movement of workers from the rural south to the industrial north, arriving by train with their luggage and their hopes, and settling in hastily constructed apartment blocks on the outskirts of cities that had not been built to absorb them. In this changing country, the Fiat 500 occupied an unusual position. It was the car of the economic miracle in both directions. For the workers pouring into the cities, it represented aspiration, the first material proof that their wages could translate into ownership. For the emerging Italian middle class, professionals and small business owners and young people with disposable income for the first time, the 500 represented something different. Freedom, lightness, youth. The car was small enough to park almost anywhere. It was cheap enough that a young professional in Rome or Milan could buy one without committing to years of debt. And in the narrow medieval streets of Italian cities, the kind of streets that had been laid down centuries before anyone imagined automobiles, the 500 fit where larger cars could not go. Rome's Via Condotti, the back streets of Naples, the hill roads of Tuscany, the winding lanes of Palermo. The 500 was at home everywhere that larger cars were a burden. Italian culture began to absorb the car in a way that had nothing to do with its original purpose as basic transportation. The 500 appeared in films. It was driven by characters who were supposed to embody modern Italian life. Stylish, mobile, unburdened by the weight of the past. Celebrities drove them. Designers in Milan drove them. The same car that had been built as the cheapest possible option for the least affluent buyers was being claimed by the most image-conscious part of Italian society. This was not a marketing campaign. Fiat did not plan this. The meaning of the Fiat 500 changed because the people who adopted it changed, and because the car itself was versatile enough, light enough, visually simple enough to carry almost any meaning that an era wanted to project onto it. Then came Carlo Abarth, and the story changed again. Abarth was a tuner, a man who took other manufacturers' cars and modified them for performance. Born in Austria but working in Turin, he had founded his own company in 1949 and spent the 1950s producing high-performance versions of small Fiats for racing enthusiasts. His business was built on the idea that a small, light car, properly tuned, could be competitive in categories that would surprise larger and more expensive machinery. In February 1958, Abarth brought a modified Fiat 500 to the Autodromo Nazionale Monza, the famous banked racing circuit north of Milan, and ran it continuously for 7 days, 24 hours a day, for 7 consecutive days, over more than 18,000 kilometers. The modified car, with its 2-cylinder engine tuned to approximately 26 horsepower, averaged 108 kilometers per hour for the entire duration and set 6 international speed and endurance records in the process. The practical result was that a 13-horsepower city car, in modified form, had demonstrated both speed and mechanical reliability that nobody would have predicted from its basic specification. Fiat took notice. The company ordered 100 modified versions to be sold through dealerships as Fiat Abarth 500s. The collaboration that followed would eventually produce the Abarth 595 and 695. Variants with enlarged engines, uprated brakes, stiffened suspensions, and performance that made the tiny 500 a genuine competitor in amateur racing across Europe. The significance went beyond racing. What Abarth demonstrated was that the Fiat 500 was not merely a car for people who couldn't afford anything better. It was a platform, a foundation, a machine whose simplicity and lightweight made it capable of transformation. The same engineering that made it cheap to own and easy to park also made it responsive to modification in ways that heavier, more complex cars were not. A car built for people who could barely afford a car had quietly revealed a second identity. A sporting machine in miniature, beloved by enthusiasts with far more money than the original buyer had ever possessed. By the early 1960s, the Fiat 500 had escaped almost entirely from the problem it was originally built to solve. When Giacosa designed it, the fundamental question was, how do we give basic transportation to Italian workers who cannot afford existing cars? By 1962, 1963, 1964, that question was becoming less urgent. Because Italy's economy was growing fast enough that a widening circle of buyers could afford the Fiat 600 or even the Fiat 1100 if they saved carefully. The 500 was no longer the only answer to poverty. It was beginning to be something else. The variants multiplied. The Fiat 500 Giardiniera, a small estate version with the rear seat replaced by cargo space, was built alongside the standard car. though notably it was eventually produced under the Autobianchi name due to space constraints at Fiat's main factory. It served small businesses, delivery operations, craftsmen who needed to carry tools. The 500 Sport offered white bodywork with red stripes, a full metal roof replacing the fabric panel, and an engine enlarged to 4999C, producing 21.5 horsepower. Even in this form, it would struggle to reach 65 miles per hour, but it looked the part. The Vignale Gamine appeared, an open-topped interpretation of the 500 by one of Italy's most celebrated coach builders, transforming a utilitarian platform into something that looked like a miniature roadster. Ghia produced their own version with the roof removed entirely, creating what became known as the Jolly, a beach car intended for resort use. Even the original German connection appeared when the NSU Fiat Weinsberg 500 brought a more angular interpretation of the same mechanical package to the German market. What had been designed as the most austere possible automobile was being dressed by Italy's finest coach builders. The contradiction was perfect and typical of what the 500 had become. In New Zealand, a company called Torino Motors assembled versions of the 500 locally. In Austria, Steyr Daimler Puch built their own interpretation, the Puch 500, with a different engine and sufficient mechanical changes to make it a distinct vehicle in its own right, sold across Central Europe. In Spain, Seat produced licensed copies for the domestic market. The Fiat 500 had become a global template for small car thinking, studied and adapted by industries far from Turin. The numbers accumulated steadily. The car that had struggled in its first months of sales eventually found a rhythm, and then a momentum. By the time production ended in 1975, nearly 4 million Fiat 500s had been built. Not 4 million of a luxury product. Not 4 million of a performance car. 4 million of the cheapest, most basic automobile that Dante Giacosa could design. But the end of production in 1975 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something stranger, as the 1970s became the 1980s, and the 1980s became the 1990s. The cars that had once been sold cheaply to workers who needed basic transportation began to change in meaning for a third time. Old 500s, left in garages or abandoned in courtyards, started to attract interest not from buyers who needed transportation, but from buyers who wanted something that felt connected to a specific Italy. The Italy of the economic miracle, of la dolce vita, of a particular kind of Mediterranean optimism that the increasingly complex and expensive modern world seemed to have left behind. By the early 2000s, unrestored and barely roadworthy Fiat 500s from the 1960s were selling at prices that would have seemed absurd to their original owners. The same car that a factory worker had purchased because it was the cheapest option on the market was now being bought at a premium by people who found exactly that simplicity and austerity romantic. This is the irony that the Fiat 500's history keeps returning to. A car built for people who could barely afford a car became, after its production ended, a car that people paid premiums to acquire because of what it represented. Not what it did, what it meant, what it gestured toward, what era it evoked. Fiat's leadership in the 2000s was watching this. The company was in a difficult moment, market share eroding, foreign competition strengthening, a financial situation that required careful navigation. They had seen what BMW had done with the Mini in 2001, taken a beloved British classic and relaunched it as a modern premium product that used nostalgia as a commercial strategy. The results had been considerable. Roberto Giolito, a designer at Fiat's Centro Stile, had been working on a concept that suggested the same direction. The Fiat Trepiuno, presented at the Geneva Motor Show in 2004, was a study that deliberately evoked the proportions and visual logic of the original 500. Round headlights, compact circular silhouette, a friendly face that referenced the original without copying it. The reaction from the public was immediate. People understood what they were looking at and responded warmly. Fiat made a decision. The 500 would return. On July 4, 2007, exactly 50 years to the day after the original launch, the new Fiat 500 was unveiled at the Turin Motor Show. The timing was deliberate. The design, led by Giolito and refined for production by Frank Stevenson, was an act of careful translation. The original 500's visual personality updated for a contemporary car that would need to meet modern safety and emissions regulations, sit on a modern platform, and compete in a European city car market that had become considerably more sophisticated in the intervening decades. The new car was built on a shortened version of the Fiat Panda platform. It offered a range of small petrol and diesel engines, modern safety equipment, and, crucially, a degree of personalization that the original 500 had never contemplated. Fiat claimed over 500,000 possible specification combinations at launch, covering exterior colors, interior trims, decals, and accessories. Where the original 500 had been standardized to the point of austerity, the new one was a canvas. The personalization was the product. In its first 2 days on sale, demand exceeded the production planned for 2 full quarters. It won the European Car of the Year award for 2008. Over its production life, the 2007 500 sold more than 3 million units across more than 100 countries. The car that had been designed for Italian workers who could barely afford it had become 50 years later a global fashion object sold to buyers in cities that had never heard of Dante Giacosa, in countries that had no particular connection to post-war Italy, and at price points that would have been incomprehensible to the workers in Turin who had purchased the first ones. There is a particular kind of transformation that only a handful of objects in history managed to complete. It begins in necessity and ends in desire. It starts as a solution to a problem that urgency creates and finishes as a symbol of a life that people want to inhabit. Even when the original problem is long gone, and even when the people buying the symbol bear almost no resemblance to the people the solution was originally built for. The Fiat 500 completed that transformation more completely than almost any other automobile. Dante Giacosa designed a car for people who could barely afford a car. He did not design it to become a fashion object. He did not design it to appear in museum collections. He did not design it to be sold 50 years later to buyers in Tokyo and Sydney and New York, who would choose its exterior color from a catalog of dozens of options. He designed it to be the cheapest thing that could honestly be called an automobile and get a working Italian family from one place to another. The fact that this machine, constrained at every dimension, stripped to the minimum, built to a price that represented hardship savings for its first buyers, became one of the most recognizable and desired automobiles in history, says something uncomfortable. Perhaps the qualities that poverty forces, lightness, simplicity, proportion reduced to what is essential, sometimes produce beauty that wealth cannot. Perhaps the constraints that Giacosa was working under were not limiting the car but clarifying it. Or perhaps Italy changed so completely during the 60 years following the 500's launch that the car stopped representing where Italy had been and started representing where Italians wished they still were. The economic miracle that the 500 helped make real also made the 500 obsolete. And then, when the miracle had long since passed, and Italy had become as complex and expensive and anxious as any other wealthy European country, the little car that had carried the workers through the narrow streets of post-war Turin became a vessel for a nostalgia that had nothing to do with poverty, and everything to do with wanting to believe that life could still be as simple as a canvas roof, a 2-cylinder engine, and a city street narrow enough that nothing larger could pass. Today, a fully restored original Fiat 500 from the early 1960s can sell for prices that its first owner could not have imagined. It sits in the same museums where the objects of Italian high culture are displayed. It is advertised in the same magazines where Italian fashion appears. The car that was built for people who could barely afford a car has become the car that people collect to prove they understand what Italy meant. Dante Giacosa died in Turin in 1996, at 91 years old. He had lived long enough to see the first generation of nostalgia arrive, to see the car he built as a minimum become regarded as something timeless. What he designed as the floor turned out, over 6 decades, to look a great deal like a ceiling. And the strange thing about that particular irony is that it was not inevitable. It was earned by a country's transformation, by a car's versatility, by an engineer's instinct for proportion, and by the peculiar human habit of finding in old necessities the things that feel most like freedom. The 500 was not the last car born from the pressures of a country trying to reinvent itself on a budget. A few years before Giacosa's drawing boards were producing the Nuova 500, another nation facing a completely different kind of industrial emergency had quietly produced a machine that was also never supposed to become what it became. That story involves a surplus of wartime materials, a country running short of the steel it needed to build proper cars, and a farm in the British countryside where a decision was made that nobody fully understood at the time. That car was the Land Rover, and its history runs through post-war Britain the way the 500s runs through post-war Italy, through scarcity, through improvisation, through the stubborn human instinct to make something useful out of almost nothing.